Imagine owning land that has been in your family for generations. Land where your grandfather planted crops, where your father worked the soil, and where you plan to build a future for your children. Now imagine waking up one day to discover that it's gone. Not because you sold it, not because you failed to pay for it, but because a homeowners association quietly signed it away without your knowledge. This wasn't just a piece of property. It was 1,500 acres of blood, sweat, and history, stolen from under the feet of a black man whose family had held on to it through decades of hardship. The HOA believed they were untouchable, backed by money, influence, and the arrogance of power. They thought he wouldn't fight back, that he would accept the loss, that his voice would be too small to shake their system. But what they didn't count on was that the very law they used against him could be turned back on them. With unshakable determination, he studied the legal codes, traced the HOA's filings, and discovered something shocking. While they had stolen his land illegally, he could legally acquire theirs. One by one, the homes they thought they owned, the manicured lawns they took pride in, and the streets they called theirs, all fell under his rightful claim. The same system that had once been used to rob him became his weapon of justice. And when the dust settled, the people who mocked him, dismissed him, and stole from him now lived in houses that legally belonged to him. This is not just a story of revenge. It is a story of power reclaimed, of justice delivered, and of a man who refused to be erased. Marcus Green stood on the porch of his farmhouse, the morning air still heavy with dew, as he looked out over the rolling land that stretched as far as the eye could see. 1,500 acres of history, hard work, and sacrifice lay before him. Land that had been in his family for nearly a century. It wasn't just dirt and trees. It was a story written in every fence post, in every grove of oak, in every acre that had been cleared by his grandfather's callous hands. The farm was where his father had taught him to drive a tractor, where his mother had planted rows of corn and beans, and where his dreams had always begun. Marcus knew the land better than anyone. Every inch of it held a memory. To him, this land wasn't just his. It was his bloodline. That morning, however, something unusual caught his eye. In the far distance, where his property bordered the newer housing development, he saw dust rising. It wasn't the soft haze of a tractor working. No, this was a sharp, disruptive plume of heavy machinery. Curiosity tugged at him, and unease soon followed. He grabbed his hat, got into his truck, and drove down the dirt path that ran along the edge of his property. As he drew closer, his heart dropped into his stomach. There, on his land, were bulldozers tearing into the soil. Men in hard hats shouted over the roar of engines. Stakes had been hammered into the ground. Spray paint marked lines and piles of earth were already being moved. It looked like the beginning of a massive construction project. Marcus slammed the truck door shut and marched toward the nearest worker. "Hey!" he yelled, his voice sharp with disbelief. "What do you think you're doing?" The man, startled, lowered his clipboard. "Sir, we've got clearance to begin development. This is part of the new expansion." "Expansion?" Marcus barked. "This is my land. My family's land. You're trespassing." The worker frowned, flipping through the papers on his clipboard. "We've got the deed right here. It belongs to the Greenfield Homeowners Association now. We're just doing our job." The words hit Marcus like a blow to the chest. Deed? Homeowners Association? That was impossible. He hadn't sold anything, hadn't even considered it. His father's last words to him had been protect the land, to never let it go. Marcus snatched the papers from the man's hands and scanned them, his eyes burning with confusion. Sure enough, the documents bore an official seal, signatures, and language that claimed the 1,500 acres had been transferred. His name wasn't anywhere on it. The date of sale was listed as 3 months earlier, but he hadn't signed anything. He hadn't received a penny. "This is fraud," Marcus said, his voice trembling with anger. "This land doesn't belong to you or your association. It's mine." "Sir," the worker replied, nervously stepping back. "You'll have to take that up with HOA. We're just contractors." Marcus stormed back to his truck, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He drove straight to the county records office, his heart pounding the entire way. He needed answers, needed proof that this was some kind of mistake that could be fixed with a signature or a correction. But when he stood at the counter and demanded to see the records, the clerk quietly pulled up the file. There was, plain as day, the deed listed under the Greenfield Homeowners Association. According to the system, Marcus Green no longer owned the land. How is this possible? Marcus asked, his voice breaking. That's my land. My grandfather bought it in 1932. My father worked it his whole life. I never sold it. The clerk gave a sympathetic look, but shrugged. I'm sorry, sir. All I can tell you is what's in the system. If you believe this was fraudulent, you'll have to take it up in court. Court. The word sank into Marcus's chest like a stone. He knew what that meant. Lawyers, money, time, and endless battles against people who had more resources than he could ever dream of. The HOA wasn't some small-town neighborly group. It was a board of wealthy homeowners, developers, and lawyers who had already pushed back farmland and woods to make way for their gated community. They had power, influence, and friends in high places. He was just one man standing in their way. Still, Marcus refused to let despair swallow him. He drove back home in silence, his eyes fixed on the familiar landscape. Every fence post, every row of trees seemed to plead with him. Fight. His father had told him once that land was the only thing no one could take from you, because it was rooted in the earth. But today, he had learned that men with money and paper could take anything if you weren't careful. When Marcus pulled back into his driveway, he stepped out of the truck and stood for a long moment, staring across the fields. The soil was rich and dark, the same soil his family had bled for. It was more than acres. It was his soul. And now, somehow it was gone. He felt rage rising, a heat in his chest that burned hotter than the summer sun. But beneath the rage was something else, a determination, a steel edge sharpening inside him. They thought he wouldn't fight back. They thought they could erase him with paperwork and signatures. They were wrong. Marcus sat at his kitchen table late into the night. The deed printout spread across the wood like pieces of a puzzle that refused to fit together. The single light above him flickered faintly, casting shadows that seemed to stretch the weight of his frustration. He read each line over and over, searching for cracks in the fraud that had stolen his family's land. His coffee had long since gone cold, but he didn't notice. Every time his eyes landed on the words Greenfield Homeowners Association, his stomach twisted tighter. The audacity of it, the arrogance to believe they could just take 1,500 acres that did not belong to them. He decided he wouldn't let anger cloud his judgment. Instead, he would confront them. He would go straight to the people who had signed their names on the theft of his legacy. The next morning, Marcus shaved, put on a clean shirt, and drove toward the polished neighborhood that had sprouted near the edge of his land. He had always hated the sight of it. Rows of identical houses lined with stone mailboxes, manicured lawns clipped to perfection, cars polished so clean they seemed to sparkle in the sun. It was everything his farmland wasn't, everything his family never cared to be. To Marcus, it was a cage disguised as luxury. The HOA office was a 2-story brick building tucked neatly beside the development's community pool. Marcus parked his truck, its tires still coated with mud from the farm roads, and walked inside. A receptionist greeted him with a smile that quickly faltered when he introduced himself. "I need to speak with the board," he said firmly. "It's about my land." Minutes later, he found himself sitting at a long, polished table across from 5 board members. Their suits were sharp, their watches gleamed, and their faces carried that casual air of superiority Marcus had seen all his life. At the center sat Harold Whitmore, the HOA president, a tall man with silver hair and a smug smile that never seemed to leave his lips. "Mr. Green," Whitmore began, lacing his fingers together as though speaking to a child. "We were told you'd be coming by. I hope you understand that the transfer of your property was all perfectly legal. Our developers acquired it fair and square." "Legal?" Marcus shot back, his voice steady though his chest burned with fury. "I never sold that land. Not 1 acre. My name isn't on those papers. My signature isn't there. You stole it." A ripple of amusement passed between the board members, as though Marcus's words were nothing more than a mild inconvenience. "Now, Mr. Green," Whitmore said smoothly, "I understand this is difficult, but sometimes progress requires sacrifice. Your land is valuable, and our community has plans to use it wisely. You'll find that fighting this will only drain your resources. Courts, lawyers, fees, it's not worth the battle. My advice? Accept the situation and move forward. Marcus leaned forward, his eyes locked on Whitmore's. You think because I don't wear a suit like you, because I don't drive your cars or live in your neighborhoods, that I don't matter. But that land has been in my family for generations. You didn't just take property. You tried to erase us. One of the board members chuckled softly, shaking his head. No one's erasing you, Mr. Green. This is just business. Progress. Surely you can understand. The word stung more than Marcus wanted to admit. They didn't see him as a man, just an obstacle. To them, 1,500 acres was nothing but numbers on a spreadsheet. Future profits waiting to be carved up and sold. To Marcus, it was the sweat of his grandfather's brow, the soil stained with his father's calloused hands. It was nights spent under the stars dreaming of building something lasting. But none of that mattered to these men. They believed money and influence made them untouchable. Marcus stood slowly, his chair scraping against the polished floor. You think you've won, he said quietly, his voice like steel under pressure. But you've underestimated me. You don't know me, and you don't know what I'm capable of. Whitmore smirked, waving a dismissive hand. Mr. Green, you'll soon realize there's nothing you can do. I'd hate for you to waste your time, or what little money you might have, on a fight you cannot win. Marcus left the office with fire in his chest and a storm brewing in his mind. He sat in his truck for a long while, staring at the reflection of the neighborhood's perfectly trimmed hedges and freshly painted signs. They thought they were invincible, hiding behind paperwork, smug smiles, and the weight of their wallets. They believed he would walk away, defeated before the fight even began. But they were wrong. As he drove home, Marcus's anger transformed into something sharper. Determination. He thought about his father's lessons, about how every man has to know the rules of the game if he ever hopes to win. The HOA might have stolen his land through trickery, but Marcus realized something. If they could use a law to take from him, then he could use the same law to take from them. He didn't know yet how, but he knew this much. He would not rest until justice was served. When he arrived back at his farmhouse, he pulled a stack of documents onto his desk and opened his laptop. He would learn every line of legal code, every county record, every loophole they had used. And when the time came, he would strike back, not with fists, but with the same weapon they had used against him. The law. For the first time since the nightmare began, Marcus felt a faint spark of hope. They had stolen his land, but they had not stolen his will to fight. And that, he thought with a grim smile, would be their undoing. Marcus began his new routine before the sun came up. Long before the roosters crowed, he was already at the desk in his small study, his laptop glowing in the dim room, stacks of records piled high beside him. By day, he still tended to what remained of his farm, the smaller parcels that hadn't been swallowed by the HOA scheme. But by night, he buried himself in documents, deeds, tax rolls, and state property laws. The hours blurred together. His coffee pot worked as hard as he did, steaming into the early morning hours as his tired eyes scanned page after page. At first, the maze of legal codes made little sense. Words were stiff, tangled in technical language designed to discourage outsiders. But Marcus was patient. Farming had taught him that patience was not a weakness. It was a weapon. He highlighted sections, wrote notes in the margins, and slowly pieced together the framework of property law. What struck him most was how careless the HOA had been. In their arrogance, they had left a trail of oversight. There were fees unpaid, liens forgotten, and parcels incorrectly filed. They had built their empire too fast, assuming no one would ever look too closely. One night, around 2 a.m, Marcus came across something that made him sit up straighter. A section in the county record showed that several of the HOA's common properties, the clubhouse, a park, and even parts of the neighborhood streets, had outstanding tax claims. Small amounts, yes, but left unpaid long enough to be vulnerable to auction. Marcus felt his heart beat faster. If he played this right, he could buy them out from under the HOA, legally. The idea grew in his mind like a seed planted in rich soil. The more he studied, the clearer it became. They had stolen his land illegally, but he could reclaim power legally. Piece by piece, he could dismantle their stronghold by using the very system they had trusted to protect them. The next week, Marcus drove to the county office and requested a list of delinquent properties. The clerk, a young man barely out of college, slid the papers across the counter without a second thought. Marcus took them home and spread them out on the table. His eyes widened as he saw not just one or two, but multiple properties tied to the HOA listed as vulnerable to claim. It was as if the universe had hidden a door just for him to walk through. Still, he knew he had to move carefully. If the HOA caught wind of what he was doing, they would shut it down quickly. So he kept his work quiet, talking to no one, not even his closest friends. By day, he was just Marcus the farmer, working his fields, buying supplies at the feed store, keeping his head down. By night, he became something else entirely, a strategist, a man plotting a counterattack that no one could see coming. His first victory came quietly. At a tax auction held in a dull county courtroom with fewer than a dozen people present, Marcus raised his hand and claimed ownership of a small strip of land along the edge of the neighborhood. It wasn't much, barely a sliver of ground, but it gave him access to their development in a way the HOA had overlooked. The moment the gavel struck, Marcus felt a rush of satisfaction. It wasn't revenge yet, but it was proof his plan was working. From there, he moved faster. He bought up rights to utility easements they had neglected, strips of sidewalk, even a storm drainage lot they thought was worthless. Each purchase cost him money he could barely spare, but Marcus knew he was investing in something greater than profit. He was reclaiming dignity. He was turning their arrogance into his advantage. Late one night, as he pored over more filings, Marcus realized the scale of what he was building. If he continued, he wouldn't just own pieces of their neighborhood. He could own their homes outright, through liens and unpaid dues. Through the very rules the HOA enforced so harshly on its own members, Marcus could legally position himself as their landlord. The irony made him smile in the quiet of his study. They had mocked him, told him to accept defeat. Soon, they would pay him rent. But the work took its toll. Marcus grew thinner, his eyes hollow from sleepless nights. Friends noticed his absence at church. Neighbors asked why he looked so worn. He brushed them off with a tired smile. They didn't need to know. This battle was his alone, and he would carry it in silence until the time was right. Weeks turned into months. The stack of deeds and claims on his desk grew taller, each one a brick in the fortress he was quietly constructing. Marcus often thought his father and grandfather of the way they had fought to hold on to their land against poverty and prejudice. He imagined them standing behind him, nodding in approval, telling him to keep going. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every sacrifice his family had made, every drop of sweat spilled on that soil. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the fields, Marcus stepped outside and looked toward the glimmering houses of the HOA community. The lights in their windows twinkled like stars, but Marcus saw them differently now. They weren't untouchable fortresses. They were chess pieces, waiting to be moved, waiting for the moment when the board flipped in his favor. And Marcus Green was ready to make his move. The letters went out on a crisp autumn morning. Marcus stood at the small post office counter, sliding thick envelopes across to the clerk. Each envelope bore the name of a homeowner in the Greenfield development, sealed with the weight of months of his work. He had written each notice carefully, every word precise and backed by the law. Inside, the residents would find what no one expected: legal notification that their homes, the places they believed were theirs, were no longer theirs at all. Through liens, unpaid taxes, and overlooked filings, Marcus Green now held the deeds. He didn't need to swing a hammer or raise his voice. The system itself had spoken for him. By the time he drove back to his farmhouse, the neighborhood was already stirring with unease. The first few letters had been opened, and word spread quickly across the pristine streets. Homeowners gathered in clusters on sidewalks, holding papers in trembling hands, faces pale with disbelief. The very people who had once mocked him now looked as though the ground beneath their feet had crumbled. Marcus parked his truck and watched from a distance. He didn't feel joy exactly. What he felt was justice, sharp and undeniable. The HOA board called an emergency meeting that evening. Marcus received his own letter, an invitation. No, a demand to appear before them. He accepted, dressed in his cleanest shirt. With his documents neatly stacked in a folder, Marcus walked into the clubhouse where the board sat waiting. The air was thick with panic, disguised as formality. Harold Whitmore, the smug president, sat at the center again, but his confidence was frayed. His silver hair seemed less polished, his smile forced. "Mr. Green," Whitmore began, voice tight, "there seems to be some confusion regarding these claims you filed. Our members are receiving notices that their properties have been purchased out from under them. Surely you understand this is impossible. These are private homes." Marcus placed his folder on the table, opening it with deliberate calm. "It's not confusion," he said evenly. "It's the law. You ignored your dues, your taxes, your filings. I didn't steal anything. I followed the rules you thought didn't matter. And now, legally, those homes are mine." A woman on the board leaned forward, her voice trembling with outrage. "This is outrageous. You can't expect families to believe you have the right to their homes. This will never stand in court." Marcus met her eyes, steady and unflinching. "It already has. Every document is signed, sealed, and recorded in the county office. Check for yourself. The law doesn't care about outrage. It cares about paperwork." Whitmore's mask slipped then. He slammed his hand on the table. "This is extortion, Green. You're trying to hold this community hostage." Marcus leaned forward, his voice low and sharp. "Hostage? You stole 1,500 acres from me. Acres that belonged to my family for generations. You bulldozed our history and laughed in my face when I demanded justice. Now the law has turned on you, and you call a hostage taking? No, this is balance." The room fell silent. The board members shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between the papers in front of them and Marcus's steady expression. For the first time, they realized they were not dealing with a man they could dismiss. They were dealing with someone who had outplayed them on their own battlefield. That night, chaos rippled through the neighborhood. Families argued in their kitchens, voices raised, children crying. Some stormed into the HOA office demanding answers. Others called lawyers who, after reviewing the records, could only confirm the grim truth. Marcus Green's claims were airtight. The very bylaws the HOA had enforced so strictly had been their undoing. Marcus didn't celebrate. He sat on his porch, watching the stars blink awake in the night sky. A strange quiet settled over him. Victory didn't taste like triumph. It tasted like justice, heavy and bittersweet. He thought of his grandfather, who had once told him, "If you can't fight with fists, fight with patience. The land will remember who it belongs to." Marcus had done just that. The land hadn't forgotten. It had returned its strength in a way no one could have predicted. The next morning, Marcus drove into town. As he passed a development, he saw homeowners out front, their perfect lawns suddenly meaningless. Some glared at him. Others looked away in shame. He didn't wave, didn't gloat. He simply drove on. He knew their anger wasn't really about him. It was about realizing that the system they thought protected them had betrayed them. The system had crowned Marcus instead. When he returned home, he sat at his desk and drafted new letters. He had a choice now. He could evict them all, strip them of the comfort they had once stolen from him. Or he could make them tenants, paying rent to the man they once dismissed as powerless. He thought about it carefully, weighing revenge against responsibility. In the end, he chose the latter. He didn't want their lives destroyed. He wanted them to understand. He wanted them to live every day knowing that the man they tried to erase now held the keys to their homes. As the sun dipped low, painting the fields gold, Marcus walked out to the edge of his land and looked toward the development. The sound of children playing drifted faintly through the air, mingled with the murmur of uneasy adults. For once, Marcus felt no bitterness. Justice had come, not in fists or flames, but in ink and signatures. And he knew this was only the beginning. The days that followed were heavy with tension. Word spread quickly across the county, and soon the whole town buzzed with the story of Marcus Green, the farmer whose land had been stolen, who turned the tables and claimed the very homes of those who wronged him. Some people called him a hero. Others whispered that he had gone too far. But Marcus paid little attention to gossip. His focus was on what came next. He had the deeds in his hands, the power to uproot hundreds of families if he chose. Yet, as he sat on his porch each evening watching the sky burn with sunset, he knew eviction wasn't the answer. Marcus thought of his grandfather, who had once walked these fields barefoot, saving every penny to buy the first acres of land. He thought of his father, who had worked double shifts at the mill to expand that land, never complaining, only reminding Marcus that their greatest wealth wasn't money but dignity. Both men had taught him that real power wasn't destroying others. It was in carrying yourself with honor, even when the world showed you none. That was the lesson Marcus wanted to leave behind. So instead of tearing families from their homes, Marcus chose a different path. He drew up rental agreements, fair and reasonable, and sent them to each household. The terms were simple. They could stay, but the houses now belonged to him. The rent they paid would go directly into maintaining the land, the same land the HOA had stolen. It was justice, not vengeance. The irony was sharp. The very people who had dismissed him now wrote checks to his name every month. The reactions varied. Some residents swallowed their pride and signed quietly, too frightened to fight a battle they knew they couldn't win. Others sent angry letters, cursing his name and calling him a thief, as though they had forgotten who had stolen first. A few packed their belongings and left, unwilling to live in houses tied to a man they had once ridiculed. But for the majority, life went on under new terms. Their lawns were still trimmed, their cars still polished, but the foundation beneath their homes had shifted forever. The HOA board collapsed within weeks. With their authority stripped and their assets legally claimed by Marcus, they had no ground left to stand on. Harold Whitmore resigned in humiliation, his smug smile erased, his influence gone. Marcus never saw him again, but he heard whispers that Whitmore had moved out of state, unable to bear the shame of losing to the man he once mocked. Marcus didn't gloat. He simply moved forward, steady as the seasons. Over time, Marcus's farm became more than just his livelihood. It became a symbol. People from nearby towns stopped by to shake his hand, to hear the story of how he had beaten the powerful with nothing but patience, grit, and the law. Young men asked him for advice. Older folks told him his grandfather would be proud, and even those who had doubted him began to respect him. For the first time in a long time, Marcus felt the weight on his shoulders lift, but he never let pride blind him. Each month, when rent checks arrived, he set aside a portion to invest back into the land. He repaired fences, planted new crops, restored the old barn, and slowly rebuilt what had been lost. The land thrived under his care, greener than it had been in years, as though it too recognized that justice had finally been done. One evening, months later, Marcus walked the boundary of his farm, the golden light of dusk stretching long shadows across the fields. In the distance, the houses of the development glowed softly, their windows lit against the darkening sky. Children's laughter floated faintly through the air, mixing with the chirp of crickets and the rustle of leaves. Marcus stopped and listened, his chest heavy with something deeper than satisfaction. It wasn't victory, he felt, but peace. He remembered the day he had first seen the bulldozers ripping into his soil, the rage that had nearly consumed him. If he had lashed out then, with anger and fists, he would have lost everything. Instead, he had chosen patience, strategy, and resilience. And now, standing on the land his family had fought for, Marcus understood the truth his father had always tried to teach him. Justice is not about revenge. It is about restoration. The neighborhood would never forget the lesson either. Every resident who signed a check to Marcus was reminded monthly of the arrogance that had blinded them, of the man they had underestimated. And though some still resented him, deep down they knew the truth. Marcus Green had beaten them without ever raising his voice. As night settled in, Marcus looked up at the stars. They seemed brighter than usual, scattered across the sky like promises. He thought of his grandfather and father, of the long line of struggle and sacrifice that had led to this moment. The land had been stolen, but he had reclaimed something greater than acres. He had reclaimed dignity, not just for himself but for the generations before him and those yet to come. Marcus walked back to his farmhouse slowly, his boots crunching against the gravel path. Tomorrow he would rise early, tend to the crops, and continue the work his family had begun so long ago. The fight was over, the balance restored. The land was still his and always would be. And in the quiet of that evening, Marcus smiled. Not the smile of a man who had won, but the smile of a man who had endured, who had stood his ground, and who had proved that no matter how powerful the thieves, justice will always find its way home. If you felt this story, don't forget to like, share, and drop your thoughts in the comments below. Subscribe to The Black Struggle for more powerful stories that inspire and uncover the truth.